Today's conversation is about the photograph as document, archive, and absence. So they're going to consider the photograph as document, archive, and a site of absence, thinking through how photographs operate simultaneously as evidence, memory work, and sites shaped by absence, ethics, and historical rupture. Soumya is a Kolkata-based artist. He works across photography, film, and alternative archives, reconstructing archival materials and oral histories to foreground subaltern experiences in post-partition India. By blending fiction and reality with social science theory, he explores complex terrains of memory, desire, vulnerability, and identity, crafting a bold dialogue between the past and the present. Sabeena Gadihoke is professor at the AJK Mass Communication Research Center, Jamia, Millia, Islamia, and a photo historian and filmmaker whose book, Camera Chronicles, traces the life of Homai Vyarawala, India's first woman press photographer. Sabeena is also a photo historian and curator, and her recent projects include Twin Sisters with Cameras. She has served on various juries and is currently a member of the editorial committee of Trans-Asia Photography. Ranu is associate professor at Ahmedabad University and a historian of modern and contemporary art in South Asia, with a focus on photography, print history, and postcolonial studies. She recently co-edited the book Documenting Industry, Photography, Aesthetics, and Labor in India. This talk will be followed, as I said, outside with the film. So now on to Ranu for the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Alakananda and Archival Matter for organizing this symposium. And thank you, Photo South Asia for supporting this. I'm truly glad that I could be part of this conversation. I thank Alakananda's team for making the logistics fall in place, and my fellow panelists, Sabeena and Soumya. I've engaged with their works for many years now, but this is a very special opportunity also because Soumya's new film, which I haven't seen, will be screened after this conversation. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. So when we began the conversation, oh, my bad, I'm sorry. So when we began the conversation, Alakananda shared a brief with us, and she gave us a couple of pointers. As she said that the instability of the archive, of course, is one of the points that we have been talking about since the morning, but also how do we account for loss, decay, all these things. They also come back in my scholarship, in Sabeena's scholarship and curatorial work, and of course, Soumya's artistic interventions. So what I wanted to do today is to unpack the words, and that's why I have them in larger font, unpack some of the words that we deal with daily, but don't always think about them. So it's really a way of taking a step back and then think through them. So document, as we know, I mean, etymologically speaking, it has a longer history, and we use document both as a noun and as a verb. I especially want to draw your attention to the Proto-Indo-European root of dec, that is to accept. And often document come to us as this authoritative whatever, and that documents in its verb form, but also with a kind of certainty, authoritative certainty, that is often very difficult to escape. And photography is particularly vulnerable to this because, first of all, we all know, I mean, it's not only an index, although index has come to occupy the major point about thinking about photography as a sign, but also the other thing is it's also an icon. It looks like it. It's not only something was there and hence the photograph of it, but also what is there kind of looks like whatever was there. So this twin aspect of indexicality and iconicity make photographs so much more vulnerable than any other visual forms when it comes to thinking about documentary value, and the authority with which which it comes to us with certain kind of information. But at the same time, we know, and we have been talking about this since morning, that the medium, the photographic medium, steadfastly refuses to conform to any idea of any straightforward evidence, right? And as we all know, the documentary has always been a genre rather than being document per se. So it's really a form of curatorial practice, be it framing. It is a genre that we engage with, and often it comes to us as if it's a transparent window into the world, which of course it's not. And that's something that we need to keep in mind as we are talking about photographs, that it is not transparent, it is opaque, and it's important that we think about this kind of opacity, think through it. And I find often Rolla Barthes very instructive while thinking about a photograph and the photograph, where Barthes in Camera Lucida, his last book, and I have cited 1995 edition, but it was published, of course, in French in 1980, and the English translation comes in 81, where he says that, while I can talk about the photograph, where the referent is ever present, where the thing that was always comes back to us, I find is as difficult to talk about a photograph where I'm not paying attention to the referent. So the referent adheres. So that's a famous dictum that Barthes has given us, and that kind of stays. But at the same time, if we think through, along with Barthes a little into the book, he also talks about how photograph is an emanation, and why the photograph as a sign may not work as well as when we think about the ontology of photography or the phenomenology of photography, right? So it's not simply a sign, but also the thing that was there, that very famously says that. And I guess the point of emanation and the point of the thing that was there allows us to think about photographs not simply as what is depicted, but far beyond that. And that's exactly where memory kicks in, where the memory we talk about related to photographs are not limited within the frame, but exceeds beyond, right? And documentary and document pushes their conceptual limits exactly there, where it's not what you see, but what you can think of, what lies far beyond. And thinking about document and documentary and the whole fluidity of the business, especially how fluid photography is, I always cite this example, a very famous photograph again. Please don't photograph this, because I don't have permission to share, although I have permission to use for academic purposes. So this is 1946 Andhra Pradesh, Sunil Jana's photograph after the famine began in 1943, began as in sort of Bengal famine 1943, although famine was there before and after, as we know. Now, when you see this photograph in this form, it comes to you in a particular way, and 1,000 apologies on behalf of the sun that is kind of ruining the grayscale. First, it comes to you differently than when it was first published, and we are mostly used to seeing this one than this. This is how it was published. This is how it was published in People's Age in 1946. Like really small space, and also is cropped according to the editorial requirement of the broadsheet. So you have it cropped. So that's the first iteration, and that's why I have the full spread for you. The next time it was published was in 1954 in Illustrated Weekly of India, and this is also, my bad. This is also from famine. This is Mysore, and Barkwhite also has. Margaret Barkwhite also has a similar kind of photograph, and we can talk about that later. But these two photographs were published with the title Dispossessed. Now, in the context of 1954, immediately after the partition, 1947, this photograph did not simply remain as a document of the famine or Jana's interpretation of the famine, but exceeded far beyond in order to think about human dispossession and human precarity. And most people seeing this in 1954 would probably have seen this in context of the partition and the communal violence. And there's no sign of famine as such, and emaciated bodies were all over around the period anyway. So the specificity of the context is not there, yet the photograph itself stands for a bigger human calamity. The next time the same photograph was published is in Marg in its 1960 edition. That was the first photography volume that Marg published, and it was published as part of Sunil Jana's portfolio titled Old Age. Right? So in this changing context, what we really have is also the changing meaning of what the photograph stands for. Of course, the people were there, that's why the photograph is here, that's for sure, but the meaning of the particular photograph is changing depending on what context it is getting published and the context in which people are seeing them. Of course, people seeing this photograph in 1916 in Marg is very different from this room. We are encountering, and when I show you in a sequence in a very curated way, it comes to you, my bad, it comes to you yet another, in yet another different form. So what is archive? And for that, let me again go back to etymology. I have had a bit of linguistic training, and that pushes me to go back to etymology, which I often find very useful. And so from Greek government to Greek public records to Latin, and finally in French to English, we have archive, again, both as a noun and as a verb now, but the verb starts really from the 19th century. And although in 1995, Jacques Derrida very famously said that nothing is less clear today than the word archive, even in 2026, it remains pretty much the same. It's one of the most notorious words that you can ever come across. So, and when we think about that, and the fluidity of the image, the fluidity of archive itself, and the fluidity, so what we are dealing with here is really the fluidity of being, of belonging, right? So, and in the process, what is absent? And that has been one of the points of our discussion. Absence can come in different form, like missing altogether. It can be forgotten. It can be obscure. And of course, the paradox of being absent present. I mean, the elephant in the room, as we colloquially refer to things, right? So then what is documenting and archiving absence? And when I think through the archives that have worked all along, especially for this conversation regarding Sabeena's own work, historical work, curatorial work, Shomo's artistic work, how to think of absence through photography that thrive on indexicality and iconicity, a simultaneous casual relationship and resemblance between the photographic referent and the photograph. So how do we really think? And and I don't have really an answer, neither am I looking for an answer. It remains an open question and a point of entry to have a broader conversation. So absent archive and archival absence are things that we all deal with in our respective endeavors. And for the next 2 minutes that I have probably, I want to run you very quickly through the kinds of ephemera that I have used in my research. So an ephemera is something that Amar was talking about earlier when talking about the student project upstairs, right? And when we write histories of photography, or any history, so to speak, very orthodox historians often discard ephemera, but increasingly in historical studies, ephemeras are making a way in, oral histories are making their way, and these are becoming really, really important sites to think about what the past means and how much we think about the present in relationship to whatever kind of past that we are looking at. And here you have a negative wallet, and it's a very old negative wallet, and that doesn't exist anymore, from this institution called Chitrabani in Calcutta. It started in 1971. 1981 by this Jesuit priest, Gaston Roberge. And from late 1970s through the 1990s, they ran photo documentation of Kolkata and the neighboring region and created a body of 12,000 photographs. And so when I'm looking at the photographs, when I write about them, and unfortunately, I'm the very few people who have actually written on that archive. It was there, it is there, but it is obscured. It's kind of forgotten, and often it just lies there in obscurity. So that's why obscure is the word that often informs the kind of choices I make in my methodology. So I look at the photograph, but I also look at these kinds of wallets that have information about the project, the subject. This one is not as much elaborate. It also talks about a time when telephone numbers were like 6-digit as opposed to longer ones. Also, the cards, the cataloging cards, they become a very important sites to look for information that you do not always find in the photographs. Of course, they are not meant to be there, but how can we use other kind of sources, other kind of ephemera to complement the photograph in better understanding the images themselves? So they are not substitute for images. I'm not claiming that, but I'm saying that different kinds of memorabilia, how do I go back? The wallets, all these things play a major role in thinking about the image itself. Likewise, I've also used these kinds of first-day covers when I've written about industrial photography. So when you're looking at the photograph versus when you're looking at photograph, together with how the first-day covers were inspired by photographs. And by the way, this one is directly taken from a Sunil Jana photograph. I don't have that here. But this kind of intermediate relationship between photographs and other kinds of images and archives are important for me as a historian to think about the history of the image. Likewise, I look at advertisements a lot. So when I look at Illustrated Weekly of India, it's not simply the stories or the images that I'm focused on. I'm also very curious about what kind of advertisements are getting published, especially advertisement related to the photographic material. So here you have Kodak helps you see news, and here when they're advertising an Ilford, they're actually saying how Ilford is better than German films, and elsewhere, oh yeah, this is Kodak. Kodak's new rare element glass destroys the legend of German supremacy within quotes in lens making. So defeating the Axis power in the fields is as important as defeating their engineering prowess on the pages of these kinds of publication. And I think, again, it adds an added layer to how you think of the image and its relationship to the publics or the public life of images, more generally speaking. And finally, again, I mean, this is one of my favorite memorabilia. This is Alfred Stieglitz's bronze medal from Photographic Society of India 1998 competition, where he won bronze. Other people won other things. And what I find intriguing here is not simply the fact that Alfred Stieglitz got it, but also the kind of iconography used on the medals. What are we looking at here when this medal is being presented for a photography competition? What is photography if this is what the iconography is to represent the medium? And finally, not finally, I have one more. So my bad. You know, I'm an archive buff, and once I get a chance, I usually don't let it go. So, this one. So I also use these kinds of information when I'm writing about the images, and especially decayed images, and I'm more interested in the ones that were never preserved. Clearly, I mean, these holes tell you how it was just lying around somewhere. The damage emulsion give you a sense that it was never preserved. It was never meant to be preserved. There's a card visit meant to be exchanged, and that's pretty much it. But what do we know, not simply about this person, this little boy, but also about the visual culture and, more importantly, the material culture of the time. And finally, how do photographs, the kinds of archive that all three of us engage with, challenge and complicate the dominant discourse of history of photography? So I've worked on pictorialism in Bengal, and you don't have any photographs left from the period. All you have are prints of the photograph in these kinds of literary magazines, and they are very bad scans, as you can see, right? And if these are the kinds of archival traces that I have to think about a period of an image culture and photographic practice, how might I think about it differently? Other than if this was perfectly preserved? Is there a way of addressing decayed images in a way that perfectly preserved images don't allow us to do? So these are really important questions for me in my scholarship and how I look at the image. And Soumya and Sabeena, we have been talking for a while. We share some of these concerns. And so on that note, I will hand it over to Sabeena.
Ranu, should I come this side? Maybe it will be easier. Yeah. Good evening, and thank you to the organizers. Ranu's already said the thank you, so I'm not going to repeat them, but I'm deeply grateful to be called to this workshop. And in my presentation, I will talk about the archive and its silences and how they have been addressed by the artist Azadeh Akhlaqi, who obsessively returns to the tumultuous history of Iran, revisiting given historical accounts to question and to reimagine them. Most of you will be familiar with the work that I show at the beginning, which is by an eyewitness, which is her painterly and cinematic stills that fictively reconstructed the unexplained deaths of popular figures over a century of Iranian history from, I think, 1908 to 1979. Her work bears witness to events that were never captured by the camera, and she memorializes them and mourns these individuals whose lives were prematurely cut short by death. Now, the archive is certainly not absent in Azadeh's work. If anything, she's like a detective. Hunting for eyewitness testimonies, confidential documents, newspaper articles, and images about these events. And she also references a global archive of violence, trauma, and resistance in classical painting and contemporary press photographs, using resemblance across historical moments as a template for her settings or her protagonists, who are often non-actors. So just to give you an example, the previous image, which is an image of the death of the popular communist leader Taghi Arani, who was tortured in 1940. The actor who played his grieving mother, you see her right in the front, was deliberately chosen because of her strong resemblance to another publicly grieving mother, Parveen Fahimi, whose 19-year-old son, Sohrab Arani, went missing and was killed during the Green Revolution in 2009. In his evocative description about and I'll show you just maybe one more, so you get a sense of how she references, she does this for gestures, she does it for her settings, and she's constantly, referring to this larger archive of images. Now, in his evocative description about the obsession with archiving as a fever, and you were quoting the same, I think 1995, Ranu, Derrida speaks about the inevitable loss and amnesia inherent in the drive to capture everything. And Azadeh's own interest in absence echoes this. Despite her feverish interest in archives, she has always eschewed claims of clarity and the certitude of objective historical accounts, or even what she terms as witnesses, the fact that we assume that witnesses are authentic or unmediated. Speaking about her painstaking process, she says, I first went to eyewitnesses and whatever was left of them, then what the press published at the time, then documents, and finally historical books. But it is interesting that the same eyewitnesses can also be the beginning of a misguided path of discovery, because recall in people's minds changes shape over time. Her work is predicated on an understanding about the generational loss of inherited memory and how historical accounts are themselves always projections. These contradictions find expression in her work, in the play between documentary evidence and its supposed truth claims, and the speculative, where she uses fiction and critical fabulation, I'm borrowing a term from Saidiya Hartman, allowing history and her own imagination to meet. So again, an image that you all might be very familiar with. This cinematic frame stages the seconds before the death of a young activist, Marzieh Oskui, who was killed in a confrontation by the militia of the Shah in 1974. On the right of this panoramic frame, so you see Azadeh there, and you see Azadeh, a time traveler, transported into this moment, running with Hamid Ashraf, who was also an activist and was in love with Marzieh. She holds his arm, intervening in this moment, warning him, cautioning him about the future. 2 years later, Hamid Ashraf would suffer the same fate, but images of his death would have been far more graphic, as he was gunned down on the roof of a house where he lived with his comrades. Despite knowing the details of this very violent encounter, Azadeh chooses a different death for him. She rearranges the body of Hamid and others in biblical postures inspired by Byzantine paintings, with sunlight streaming in from the door and minimal signs of blood. Like most artists in Iran who find creative ways to respond to the silences imposed by state censorship, she also alludes to different historical moments of repression through books which are strewn on the ground, you see them there, or the uniforms of officers from different moments in this frame. So they're all from, the books are contemporary, and the uniforms are, of course, of 3 different historical times. Another way in which Azadeh addresses absence is by including the often unspoken infanticity, the partiality of feelings, emotions, or affective atmospheric details. She says, and I quote, "Many of the people that I spoke to couldn't remember the details. For instance, they could remember the incident, but they couldn't recall what the weather was like that day. Asking, was it cold? Was the sun shining? Was it raining? Was there a breeze?" Azadeh draws in the sensory, not just what was seen, but what was heard, felt, and experienced using her digital wand. And in this sense, she recreates, to my mind, the absences often overlooked by traditional historiography that doesn't really often focus on the sensory. If by an eyewitness focused on well-known figures of history, she makes a substantive leap in her recently completed masterful body of work, Witness, A Nation's Scars of Time, that she created over 13 years, that also returns to tumultuous formative events in Iran. Let me take you to the next slide. Azadeh has often spoken about her fascination with Russian literature, with novels like Tolstoy's War and Peace, because of their description of those on the periphery, the people, the crowd, or even the mob. Witness stages the participation of known as well as unsung actors of history in 16 large tableaus that have between 500 to 1,000 people in one frame, and I'm only showing you sections of the frame. She carefully reconstructs nameless protagonists who have only been identified as shopkeepers, barbers, butchers, wives, sisters, and mothers by returning to partial, selective, incomplete, and often contradictory accounts. At times, the catalyst could be a peripheral detail. For instance, her magnificent The Mother of Tabriz, which is what you're watching right now, recreates the tragedy of a big event, the Russian invasion of the city of Tabriz over 6 years from December 1911 till October 1917. But the inspiration for this tableau was a brief description about an unknown mother in the city of Tabriz, whose young teenage sons were brutally hanged for raising slogans on the first day of Ashura, or Muharram, January 1st, 1912. Unaware of their death, the mother continued to send them food in prison. Azadeh speculates about her crazed grief when she is eventually told about this, but she places her within a dense mosaic of micro-detail and people known and unknown who were part of this unfolding event. So, and this again is a very small section. In this, you will see not just Mehdi Gavkash, for instance, the ordinary butcher, but also Ahmad Kasravi, the historian who would eventually write about the siege of Tabriz, and many more, including Mehdi's wife and children who would have suffered the consequences of his death. And here is Azadeh, of course, in the center, shielding the mother from seeing the unseeable. All these tableaus are compressed archives with several stories set over multiple times and places in one image. Now, my last image, of course. While the texture of most of these 16 images is very dark, I want to end by one that, to my mind, deviates from this mode. The immediate cause for the massacre and repression in Tabriz was a Russian demand that the constitutionally elected parliament send back their American financial advisor, Morgan Schuster. Schuster was forced to depart, and on his return to New York, he wrote a book with a small paragraph about 300 brave Iranian women in black veils and headscarves with pistols marching to parliament to protest the siege of Tabriz. Who were these women, and how did they come together in defiance? Schuster's lines, written in passing, become the inspiration for Azadeh to speculate about this mobilizing moment when they prepared to march to Parliament on December 1st, 1911. She calls this the first Iranian women's movement. In a leap of imagination, she brings together over 100 women who would have been alive in 1911, albeit of different ages, to be part of a room full of hope and possibility. She traces a dense tapestry and web of connections between these unruly and non-conforming women who may or may not have known each other, but who would have created the affective environment for this event to happen. Among them are defiant characters who have names and archival references, but no photographs, such as Bibi Khanum Astarabadi, who wrote a book called The Defects of Men. You see her in this picture talking to these young students. And she cut her daughter Khadije's hair short and sent her to a school for boys, and then opened the first school for girls when she was expelled. So here is her daughter Khadija, who became a well-known journalist, and others such as the first woman photographer who documented the fashionable clothes worn by Iranian women, the first graduates in college, or those who set up a secret association for women. The first confident travelers across the seas, the first to raise slogans, and the first to confident travelers across the seas, the first to raise slogans, the first to question. Looping back to her earlier work, there are also 3 young boys in this frame, and you will see them here, one of whom would grow up to be Taghi Arani, the slain comrade, the reconstruction of whose death I showed at the beginning, and women who were only known as mothers of other heroes, like Taghi Arani in By an Eyewitness. So all these women sitting here are only known as mothers, but they are the mothers of these men who find their way into her earlier work, which is By an Eyewitness. You see Azadeh sitting among them in her red scarf, but she also inserts into this history fictive protagonists. This character is imagined from a story about a woman who was beaten for having an affair. She represents all those who were punished for straying. And the woman you see entering in the background, the woman entering the doorway, is Azadeh's gesture to those who cross-dressed and were perhaps queer. And she bases this, of course, it is sketched from photographs, not from a real person, but from photographs of the time that had women in pants, attempting to put back those who had been on the peripheries of women's histories. And she imagines all of them coming together in the office of the first woman ophthalmologist, Mrs. Kahal, who had also opened the first newspaper called Danish. Breaking with temporality, there is only one woman in this room who was not alive during this period in 1912. She appears framed on the wall at the far end of the room. She wears a wedding dress, and this is Azadeh's mother, whom she reinserts in this feminist history of the past, where women were mostly footnotes. I cannot show the explanatory video as it is 13 minutes long, but I'm going to end with this one last minute from a video that she made, which will show you this frame right at the end. As it opens, you will see women on the right preparing to march to Parliament to protest the siege of Tabriz. A little girl of 6 So that's Mrs. Kahal. Those are the women preparing to march. And a little girl sits in the center of the room, and the video will open up from her. This is Kamar al-Muluk Waziri, who would be the first woman performer to sing in public without the veil. For Azadeh, she symbolizes the voice of the women in this magical room full of promise. Can we just show the video?
So I'm Shomo, artist based in Calcutta now, but what I am trying to say is that it's always complicated for me to talk about my work in 10 minutes because it's like a years of practice, and then whenever I try to tell in 10 minutes, it always feels very disorganized, and I always think after the presentation that, oh, I have not discussed about this or this I have missed. So if sounds like disorganized again, so I'm sorry, but this is actually me always disorganized in my work and in my presentation. So it's interesting that where I grew up, I want to start from there, that I grew up in a small town called Midnapur, which is around 150 kilometers far from Calcutta. And more of my practice started from there, very early work of mine actually based in Midnapur on the Jatra artist. I worked from 2010 to 15. First 10 years, so what I have mentioned here as the image as an alternative archive. So I have not used this word alternative archive before, and that's what I wanted to start from Midnapur. Because when I thought about doing my work, I always saw that there are certain oral histories in the areas I grew up, which is not documented. The word I'm using, documented, which I don't use anymore. So I feel like how I can represent this oral history or decode this through my visuals and start creating images. But then what happened, after 10, 15 years of practice, I also realized slowly that my images also becoming the only archive for many academics in their work. And I start also understanding that for me, all these archives I have made is a fiction. Because all this work I have developed in last 15 years is basically heard from someone, and I thought and included my interpretation in it, and then I produced. So I can't say it's as an archive. And then last 4 or 5 years, because it happened particularly the work I'm going to show next, which we published as a book, Where the Birds Never Sing, is a incident happened in 1979 called Morichapi Massacre in a small island in Sundarban called Morichapi. Around 4,000 to 6,000 people died over a night. So when I produced this work from 2016 to 2020, and after that, interestingly, I started getting mails of many academics instead of the collectors. So these academics start using my images as that is the image from the Morichapi Island, but the images I have made almost 40 years after. And is also, they start saying this is the only available archive, the visual archive, only available visual archive of the incident, which is not true at all. So I start contradictory with my own work or the own word when I say it's an archive, and then I say it is not archive, it's an alternative archive. And that's how what I do now and all my practice I explain that major of my work or the images I produce is mostly the community I stayed with them for years, 3, 4 years or 5 years when I developed the work. And the perspective, how, it's also kind of contradictory for me. I always feel an image after a certain time it became very transgressive, because if the person, like, it's like a visual, but if there is no a storyteller, then the image became very blank. It doesn't have a memory, because if I am not here, then if this person is not here, so this image is very blank. It's a transgressive, because it's like what we see, it not maybe from the inside. So for me, I think this is very interesting that when I start working on this, and I met the academics, I met the people like from the government, the police, and the community. I stayed like mostly in the center part of India. So this is very contradictory in making the images, because in certain area, in certain theory, these people are the victims of the massacre. But when I meet them, I work with them, they're the survivors of the incident. And they want to become the hero of the massacre, not as the victims of the massacre. Though they lost the land, many of their relatives and friends died, but they still want to become the hero. And that's how the images you see is not as the victim. So I just want to bring the story is basically the people who came from Bangladesh after the partition. They wanted to move this island because they are Bengali, they speak Bengali, but the government decided that the refugee camp will be in the center part of the India, where the language is different, the culture is different, and the profession is also different. So in 78 middle, they start coming to the Sundarban area, and the government never actually allowed them to live there. So this conflict happened between the government and the people, and finally on the 31st January, the government with the police and the local goons from the political parties and all, they forcefully entered the island and put them back to the center part of the India. And in this process, the many people died. So I wanted to bring, because still when you see the images, you don't see them like very sad or like, still I don't want to use this word victims for my work. Any of my work, like I don't use the word. So some of the images is basically staged, because many of the people, they also like didn't want to be in my photograph, and so they just shared their memories, and I tried to make reenact the memory in the same area in the Sundarban. So it's a mixed, and then some of the letters which I got some people like some schoolmaster, 1979, 22nd January, 7 days before the massacre. So I think like what I try to do is like in my work is kind of, I get something from there. It's a very little archive, and try to find there's a loophole in that archive, that the archive does not exist for this particular incident, and I try to produce something and put it there, and then people get confused. And that is basically the work I try to do, that if it is real or if it is not real, if this really happened, is not really happened, I don't care, because I'm not the academic or anthropologist or historian to talk about like if this really happened or not. For me, it's important that these people I work with, I know them because my family also migrated from Bangladesh. So these are like the common people, and many of my work is also coming from there. And it's more important for me what they think, like what they want in the work, and also to make the work in a way so it's also accessible to the others. So the other people also are interested, because this question always arises, like if I want to make a family album, then why the people will be interested to see my family album? So then I start meeting many of these people I didn't meet before, many of their children, like who also heard the incident about from their parents, but not present there. And I always feel in this oral history is always different perspective of one particular story. Like you never know like what exactly happened and what exactly not happened. You always have to think about it. So is the schoolmaster. So it also took me like 3 years to find him, because I found this left picture in a newspaper, and then I start looking for him, and finally I found him in a remote village, and he also died after 1 year. I met him, and he also received the book, and then he sent me a text and WhatsApp, like in a voice note, and then he passed away. So it was interesting for me, like what he thinks rather than the academics actually discussing about my work. And that is always is the key thing in my work, like the representation, but I also don't want to be the people I work with, I don't want them to be the poster of the representation of the particular massacre or the particular incident. And that is why, like, this, but I also feel it's very interesting, like how, like, because once the work is gone from my hand, it's not my work. It's always will have this different perspective and perception, and that's how the work live longer. So yeah, I'll go quickly with the images, like what I made from this work, and then I'll shift to another work. So what I did once we completed the project, I went back to the island, and we did a conversation with all peoples, and I asked them, like, how you want to show this work and what is your perspective about this work. So they said, like, we want to, like, print like a larger flex, like taller than the politicians' flex, or like larger than the people like we live here. And so we decided, like, why not? So we bring all the prints from Calcutta, and yes.
জানতেও চায় না যে এটা কি হয়েছিল, কি বৃত্তান্ত সুন্দরবনে। পরবর্তী জন্মে যারা আসবে তারাও জানতে পারবে 20 বছর আগে এরকম দুর্ঘটনা ঘটেছিল সুন্দরবন এলাকায়।
And so it's interesting, like we did the show in 2020, and then this cyclone happened called Amphan, most probably in 2021. So we never like ended the exhibition. We just started the exhibition, and we thought, like, we don't know what gonna happen, like, with the prints. So after the Amphan happened, these people realized, oh, like, these are like the plastic flecks, so why not use to cover their rooftop? And so still, if you go, you will see like this degraded, like, prints, like top of their house, and still using. So yeah, so I feel like this is kind of like what I did with this project. And then I want to talk about this work, A Discreet Exit Through Darkness, which is about my mom. And yeah, so I have mentioned the archival prints, yeah, which we can archive, but the work, the image is not maybe the archive, like the value, archival value does not have the image itself. Yeah, so this work is about my mom. The film we also gonna see, like, after this. Okay. So in 1969, my mom went missing for a couple of years, 24th October, and then she went missing for a couple of years, and she came back. The police rescued, like, it has different story. I don't know exactly, like, what happened. And then nobody talked about this in my family for years. After many years, like, I read it in her diary that this happened, and then during the COVID, and my mom can't remember exactly what happened, like what this 3 years. She doesn't have any memory, and I hardly discussed with her about that, what exactly happened and not happened. That you will see also in the work. So my grandma, like, who is now 96, during the COVID, she was hospitalized, and I realized that this is a very important memory for me to keep for the future generation of my own family members to understand that what happened like during this after the partition. And 69 is a very important year for Bengalis. The Nakshal movement started. The 71 war is happening, and I live in Midnapur, which is also where you talk about the Bengal famine, like 20 years after. So this is also came in my work multiple times when you also see the film. So the thing when I started this work, this only shows that my mom went missing. There's no other information in the back, in the front. And so I had to develop it from the beginning. I had to rethink from the beginning. I did interview with the neighbors. I did interview with some relatives. My grandma is the most interesting part. Why I am talking like this is that when she start telling me the story, what exactly happened, I realized that all our memories depends on the sodium and potassium level. And she was 91 years old. She's telling me something today, and when her sodium level goes down, she tells me something else. She told me, no, it's not Shanu, it's Buban who went missing. I'm like, are you sure? No, I will tell tomorrow. I will talk about it tomorrow. So it's always like a confusing, like what happened. And that's also triggered me, like that everything is fiction when we are revisiting something after years. Because we can't go back to the past, and even if we go back to the past, so every incident, every photographs, every person who is taking the photograph, who is in the photograph, who is telling you the story, has multiple perspective, and that's how it's also interesting to see an image. So what I start developing this alternative archive of my own family history without a single photograph of my mother. So there's my grandma. The photograph was taken by my grandfather sometime in 1970. On the right side is also the photograph taken by my grandfather, which is told to me by my relatives. I don't know like if it is really taken by him or other people. Then I start making images and I mix up everything. And this is one film I made from this project, which is my grandfather's perspective. Is a VR film. So when I made the film, it's also interesting when I showed this film to my grandma told me like, oh, so it means that there is a diary of your grandfather that exists. And maybe, like what he wrote about me. I said like, okay, but everything is basically I wrote. But I didn't tell her. But that's the fun thing, like how after years, you also forget about your own memories, and then you depend on the opposite person to remind you like what exactly happened and what not happened with you. So there, I said this is my grandmom. So many of the images I have used of my grandmother but I never mention that like if it is not my talk, I never mention it's my grandma. So in some cases it also happened, like some people think my grandmom is my mom. So yeah, so these are the spaces, like I travel because the relatives told me my grandfather went to look for my mom. And I also made some pictures of my grandfather, whom I have never seen. I don't know how he looks like, I only imagine. And also interesting, like when my aunt, my mother's elder sister and my grandma both told, like when they hear the sound of my grandfather, they said, oh, this is exactly like your grandfather is talking. Like okay, but how? Because he died in 1970. But they forgot because it's all mixing up because of this chemical imbalance in our head. Yeah, and then there's a very interesting part in this story, which is because this is like the thing, like so many things happens in my work and then I missed and then I feel guilt about it. That's why I have not discussed about this part. So when I revisited the place where my mom went missing and my grandfather died, I missed this part. So when my mom went missing, my grandfather was looking for her and he also died. So when my mom was rescued, they have not met each other ever. So my mom has also had not seen him again. And he also died without realizing that she will be. So it's a very interesting that my mom went missing, and the family is trying to adjust that she will not be with the family again. And then my grandfather died, and my mom came back. And the grandfather was the key person because he was the only person who was like, like helping the family with the bread and butter. So the family was like lost when my mom came back, and they don't know what to do next. Yeah, like she came back, but they don't know like, so then when I revisited the place after years, so the local people told me that don't go to this place, it's an empty ground now. The house they demolished after my grandfather died, and they said it's a haunted place. Don't stay in this place longer because there's a ghost who keep coming back. Full moon night, half moon night, anything like that. And it's like someone who is looking for his daughter every full moon night. And that is for me is the most important archive, I think, like Indian people we have, is the ghost story, which also fictional, but also starts from somewhere. Because if we see, like, read our Bengali ghost stories, it never comes from all these Hollywood films like a doll becoming ghost. It's always like a story, and I mean not story, an incident, and this incident is how fictionalized. And even if we read Manik Bandyopadhyay's work, is always like it's a struggle, like the struggle in the society, and then is like adding this words and becoming something else. So it's also, this ghost story is carrying a very interesting archive itself. So then I realized this is my grandfather who is keep coming back. And then all the images, if you see that, is very haunting, because I always feel that my grandfather is looking for his daughter all around, and in the film also, in the places also, and then this is also from the film, but it's also I have used as a picture. So it's basically I imagined as a crow man. The crow man is kind of trying to figure out where his daughter and telling you the story through the film. But it's also kind of interesting that why I have chosen this crow man in my work, because I always feel it's, in my school, whenever our teacher used to ask us, like, tell me 5 names of birds, we never mention the crow, because that's the most familiar bird we see like everyday life, but we never mention the crow because we feel like, because it's very regular and all around us, but we don't see it as a bird. And that's how I thought about, like, my mom and the grandfather, the situation in the family, being the third girl child, being there but not being there. And so this is like the first chapter of the work. And so I also did research of the other people who also went missing from the town and came back. I did interview, but I have not used their images properly. And this is the film we are going to see after our conversation, is basically my mother's perspective of the entire story. So I don't want to explain much about it, but it's a 3-channel film. It talks about the same time period what is in the VR film, but it's a perspective what my mom thinks, like, without remembering the incident, how this incident is also affected in her life. Like, when you don't know what exactly happened with you, but the other people continuously telling you, like, oh, this happened, I remember this, etc., etc., or seeing you. And my mom has this prosopagnosia, which is like, I also have not remembering faces much. So I think, like, this is, my work is kind of like where the archive is slowly turning into fiction. And what I'm trying to tell about the people of the Morichapi is similar. Like after 40, 50 years, so many layers added in the story, and when they told about the story, so it's some people maybe not been there, but how they are telling me the story that they were there or they have witnessed it. And it's also interesting after 40, 50 years that they felt this incident is so important that they should be there. And this is, I think, is also very important for me, that how people actually use the memory and they edit it in their own way before representing it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sabeena and Shomo. I mean, as always, I really enjoyed it. And for all of us, I mean, yeah, photography promises a certain kind of accuracy, and often it delivers. But at the same time, that in the process of the delivery, things get mixed up, and often there's a overlapping, but also a gap between personal and collective memories, how things happen versus how people remember, or how there's a temporal gap between the event and the retelling of the event. And often looking for factual accuracy in survivors' testimony is kind of an elusive quest, and often an injustice to the process of survival in that way. So on that note, I have like 2 questions and more for later, but for the time being I have 2 questions. So both of you, and in your work and your narrative of Akhlaq's work, you have curated the narrative that you want to present, right? And we kind of resist this kind of fixity of the archival meaning, where those archives that we absolutely hate, I mean, and I will use the word hate because I too hate that, yeah, those are very curated archives. All archives are curated, right? But then when we are trying to articulate and counter archive or an alternative archive or whatever, resisting that fixity of meaning, we are also archiving in the process. We are also curating in the process, right? We are framing, shaping, and then stitching together stories to craft the narrative. And I was wondering how you want to address this kind of a tension in a way in all of our work. So we are resisting, but also falling into the trap. So that's the first question. And the second question is about the word archive itself. I mean, as we know, I mean, we all talk in language. I mean, yeah, and it's a language we all can use and understand. And language shape how we think about images, how we narrate images. And I was wondering if there's a way of bypassing the word archive altogether to think about repositories of memory, of being, of belonging, of thinking about the past, of thinking about the present. So is archive this definitive word that we have to stay with, or is there a way around the word to chart another path? Again, I don't have an answer to these, and I would very much welcome your interventions.
So I'll deal with the second question first, which is the archive. No, it's fine. So, I don't really have an answer, Ranu. So it's not like I have an alternative to the word archive. And I'm thinking through, because it's an interesting question. I think what we might want to do is, I mean, coming up with an alternative name will again fix us into, it'll fix us into other kinds of problems. But I think what we might want to unpack, and I think that that's something that has happened through the morning, I think that's been happening, that we are also opening up the question of what is an archive. Maybe that might be another productive way to look at it, to kind of unsettle really the notion of what is an archive. So is a collection of photographs an archive? Is my family, we often refer to our family albums as archives, right? And there is an element of curation there, which I will come back to later as well, of course. But what do we call? Is it just a selection of photographs? My students will often come and say, I've got an archive. Is that an archive? Where is an archive? Is it a place where you store things? Is it a repository? Is it a home, if that's how we understand the archive? archive, and what gets archived. I think that perhaps is also something to kind of, open up, because even the word archive carries with it a lot of weight. It's a word that's laden with power. Of course, we know that. It's also a word that is laden with authority. Placing something on a pedestal. There are people who control the archive, and I'm thinking constantly. And I was actually quite struck by some of the images, because I am very interested in this whole business of the way images travel, and I'm thinking of how. We call it the poor image, the poor image, the heterosterile. This is again a scholar who's used it, so I don't want to just use the term without mentioning heterosterile, who's an artist. She's talked about the image, which is a copy. It's a reproduction, because you use some of them as well. The low-grade, low-resolution image that somehow escapes from the archive, and we're watching that all the time. I mean, if Azadi didn't want these images to be, photographed today, obviously because she's still but she wouldn't have a problem otherwise if people took clicks, and those clicks will then circulate in other ways. They will circulate as low resolution images. They will find their ways to classes, to classrooms, to other kinds of spaces. So I think it's also a question of what do we define as the archive? And I'm always very interested in things that slip out of archives. I'm very interested in the idea of what gets archived and what doesn't. And I will just end with one example, and that is that, when I started to do a PhD, many, many years ago, I decided to work on the tabloid, which is Blitz, which was India's first tabloid, very different from the tabloidization that you see today. And this very political, they were these two magazines, Current and Blitz. And I went to Bombay to look at the archive. And my first encounter with the archive was in the, looking for the Illustrated Weekly, because I thought I'd work on the Illustrated Weekly, go to the Bombay, the Times of India building. And that's the archive, because that's the only place that you will have it. And they control it, and they make you pay for it, and all of that. And it's under strict control. And I find that what they have done is that they have copied those beautiful pages of the Illustrated Weekly into black and white CD-ROMs. It must have been an early form of digitization. And suddenly I could feel that entire, because the texture of those pages were not there. That's not the magazine that I remembered from my childhood, and I've written about it. And eventually I did find it in another archive where I could turn the pages. And it was a completely different experience. But coming back to the archive where I finally found the library, and again, do we call a library an archive? I don't know. So I went to the Asiatic Library, and the librarian met me, and she said, "Acha, aap Jamia se hain," whatever. And then she said, "Why would you want to look at Blitz? Like, why? We do have Blitz, but why would you even want?" There was a kind of a way in which she was shocked at the fact that an academic wanted to work on Blitz. So there's also this whole level of how many values we attach to the archive. Your second, maybe you have to answer first, and then I'll come back to the second question.
So your first question, I think, it's a very interesting practice itself, like how to deal and think about archive and curate it, like particular in practice. And everyone we do it, because the thing is, like, when we talk about archive, we always talk about the institutional archive, but our phone also has an archive, right? It's an archive, and how we organize this archive, like what images we want to keep and what images we want to copy, like in case the phone get lost, or what images we just delete after taking the pictures. I feel this actually, like, for me, is very interesting, that when I meet people and somehow I have access, of course, like with their permission, that to see like what images they keep, and also like in their Instagram profile, it always interests me, like, and that's, I don't have the answer, but it's always very interesting, because it's often we see like 90s family album, again this transgressive image that you see that in the family is very happy, but maybe in original the family is not happy, and so that is kind of like, it means is this hide and seek also happens there, and that's what is basically the curation, that what you want to keep through your family album that the other people see about your family, or when you are not there, so what the other people will talk about. Like when I see the images of my grandfather's family, like maybe 30, 40 years, so I don't know the family, so I have to think that understanding the time now. And so I'm not sure if they are a happy family or not, but the images is actually looking very happy, like everyone, and that always like confused me and also interests me. And when you ask me the question, so that the thought process came to my mind. I know that it's not the answer, but I think like it's kind of a
It's fine. We're all thinking
window to think about. Now, coming to the second question, I think I already mentioned in the first answer that what is the alternative word, but it's always interesting, like particularly where we live in South Asia, that the archive, this word is also very complicated. It's a very urban word because it's the only institutional use. Like you remember we discussed, like you went recently to the people of the personal archive, but these people didn't keep the images as the personal archive. They're keeping it for something else, and they're already naming it something different. Like someone say, oh, this image was in my father's wallet. So it may be a wallet image, which is maybe an archive for other people. But I feel it already has names, many multiple names, but I'm also not the right person to talk or discuss about, because it's always like, for me, I always think if there is a word like which is establishing something, then I also have to think how to de-establish it. So this is always, I think, like if someone is telling me like my work as an archive, so I always have to think how I can tell my work as an alternative archive, because this contradictory is always in my practice, and that is how I keep thinking and producing, because that is how I push myself. So I believe in archive because I feel if the archive word does not exist, then I will also not be able to conflict against it. So it should exist, so we can discuss. If it does not exist, then we have to start from the zero again. So yeah, like.
Just going to add to what Shomo said. You know, there's also this whole business. I mean, the memory is an archive, so that is an archive. And I know that there is this constant tension. You know, this whole thing that of course, the camera doesn't capture. It only captures a visual memory, right? It doesn't capture the sound. It doesn't That's what Azadi is actually trying to do. That it doesn't capture sound. It doesn't capture smell. It doesn't capture touch. And she's trying to somewhere do that in a visual medium, which is a mute medium. I mean, photography is a mute medium. But I'm also thinking of the fact that so many people say, well, the mobile phone is terrible because your memory goes away because you put everything on the phone. But I have to say I'm also very grateful to the phone because from time to time you'll have these memory things that will come up, those, and I'm so grateful for that because suddenly my mother's photographs when she was well and she didn't have dementia will come up, and there are these lovely images of her like maybe 5 years ago which I have completely forgotten about, and I'm really grateful therefore to the phone because I think that it will bring those memories up for me. Coming to your question about curation, Ranu, if I were to speak about I'm not really a curator of her work in that sense, but yes, the fact that I'm, giving a talk about her is obviously a selection.
Curation in its broadest possible scope.
And I have to say that with Azadi's work, it is dense work. It is very difficult to understand the work, and sometimes it takes me days to, she has of course given me material, and I'm looking at that material, but this is not a context. This is not the context of, it's a different context. And yet, once you get those meanings, there's this richness, this reward, because you suddenly those jigsaw puzzles fall into place. So I have to describe to you that for this image, she sent me a image which has all the women with little circles around them, numbered as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and with each of them there were these little notes. So it helped to kind of identify, because otherwise you can get completely lost in the work. And then it's wonderful when you can make those connections. So the fact that she's got those 3 little boys, one of whom is Taghi Irani. I have, been reading about Taghi Irani for the last 10 years, since I've known her work, and suddenly to think that, so she's looping back to her earlier work is also something that I find very interesting. So just wanted to end with that.
I know there are many more questions. We started late, but we went over time. I guess we can take the conversation outside.